Okay, everyone, so let's dive in here to our actual data. I downloaded, I think, the pertinent data from Tableau for this discussion. I got the subject codes here in column B, the cost of each of those subject codes, the revenue brought in by each of those subject codes, and then column E there, the cost over revenue is just the division of the cost and the revenue. Notice the unit's gone because the unit cancels, and that's one of the discussions we had earlier in the previous video. Okay, so the kicker here is what RSC has done in the past, at least for the past couple of years, is they use these things called benchmark thresholds and critical thresholds. So they compare that cost over revenue number to these thresholds. CTE is 2.04 and 3.24. CTE is up top here. And if you scroll down, here's transfer down here. So we can code Excel, and I've done it over here, to highlight the ones that trip those benchmark or critical thresholds. So now, to keep it simple in this video, I haven't indicated whether it's a critical or a benchmark threshold trigger. I personally think we need to look at all these numbers anyway, so really it's just the idea of the triggering that I really want to look at now. So, for example, human services up here triggered a benchmark threshold because when you divide 144,000 by 60,000, you get 2.4. And that 2.4 is greater than the 2.04 in the benchmark threshold. So that gets a trigger. So that becomes one of those X's in the grid that we'll look at, I'm sure, this fall. And you keep scrolling down to see the other ones, HM, which I've totally forgotten, hospitality management maybe, dental assistings there, forestry, FW, I'm not sure what FW is. But anyway, all of those are bigger than 2.04, so they all trigger a threshold. And if you scroll down to transfer, they got to be bigger than 1.41. Any number that's less than 1, like for example, looks like the apprenticeship one up here, aviation caught my attention. Aviation has a 0.1 cost to revenue. That means it brings in 10 times more than it costs. I can only imagine that's because of fees. It costs $8 million a minute to fly a helicopter. So I'm sure that that's where our $3.7 million is coming from. Or it's a typographical error, one or the other. Anyway, I'm sure we'll see it in RSC. But here's the problem. Remember back to our previous concern, these numbers in column G don't actually have dollars attached to them. Like you could point at any of those cells that are pink and say, yes, this is what costs the school money. These are too expensive. Except they're not necessarily. Here's what I did here. Next sheet over, I looked at the profit of each of these programs. Profit is just simple. You take your revenue, you subtract your costs, and the profit is what's left. Anything in parentheses in column I is a negative profit, meaning it costs more than it brings in. So for example, human services up there, the first one. They were in the hole $84,000 last academic year. Right under them, the apprenticeship program, they were positive about $7,000. Here's where it gets interesting. Look at under apprenticeship automotive. Did not get flagged because their cost over revenue didn't hit the benchmark threshold, but they actually cost more money than human services, which did get flagged. And that strikes me as odd. And if you keep looking down, you'll see other oddities. For example, culinary costs or had a negative profit of $155,000. Go down a few more. CIS had a negative profit of $175,000. That, in and of itself, is twice as negative, just about, a little bit more actually, than human services. But why didn't CIS get flagged? Well, I have an answer for that in a second. But my second criticism right now of this cost over revenue measure is simply this. It's not necessarily identifying the programs that are costing the most money. It's identifying, again, programs that cost more than 2.04 times what they make. But there's no indication of money involved in that multiple. You can scroll down and see how it applies to the transfer programs too. I mean, the first one that jumps out at me here is theater arts. Theater arts got flagged, but look at the negative. It's negative $9,700. That's it. That's a blip on the budgetary radar. But that's a check mark against the benchmark threshold, one of the 3 that theater arts would get. I mean, you know, some of them are very expensive. I get that. I totally get that some of these programs are very expensive. But the problem is the ones that are very expensive, only some of them are getting flagged by RSC. So if we're actually interested in expense, then I'm not entirely sure cost over revenue is letting us look at expense. Okay, so let's look at one more issue I've got with cost over revenue before we wrap this one up.